In the silent suburbs of Chicago, where the streets seemed lulled by a constant wind that smells of metal and wet earth, lived Linda Villa Señor, a 62-year-old woman who had learned to love silence as much as she feared it. For decades, her name had resonated in the halls of the court as the Queen of the Law, a relentless lawyer who dismantled corrupt officials with the same calmness with which she served a cup of coffee. But a case poisoned by bribery and personal betrayal shattered her faith in justice and forced her to disappear from the professional scene. Since then, she had traded the bench for a small garden filled with lavender, where she cultivated more peace than flowers. However, deep within her chest still beat that unquenchable spark, that strength that only awakens when what is most loved is in danger. Their son, Michael, was the reason for that spark. A man with rough hands and a clean soul, he had painstakingly built the house they lived in, sturdy walls, light, wood, and a constant scent of freshly baked bread. Everything seemed stable until the day of the accident. A short circuit at the construction site where he worked left him with a permanent leg injury, forcing him to rely on crutches and the constant help of his mother. At first, his wife, Jessica Torres, was understanding. Her honey-colored eyes feigned tenderness, but her patience had an expiration date. Little by little, sympathy turned to annoyance, and the annoyance transformed into contempt. Linda watched silently, every gesture, every sigh laden with revulsion, knowing that the calm before the disaster was only the prelude to something much worse. It was on a gray afternoon, one of those when the sky seems made of cement, when Linda realized Jessica was no longer hiding anything. She heard the young woman speaking to someone on the phone from the hallway, in that sweet, poisonous voice, only used by those planning something. "I can't take him anymore. He's broken. You understand?" "Broken," she said, while the steam from the tea still rose from the cup Linda had made for her minutes before. That word, broken, echoed in her mother's head like a judgment. Michael, who was struggling to walk again without complaining, didn't deserve such contempt. Linda remained silent, holding the door ajar with the same control she had exercised years before in front of a hostile jury. But this time there were no jurors, just a woman plotting how to free herself from a husband who no longer served her. The following days were a bitter choreography. Jessica left earlier, returned later, and brought with her a masculine perfume that didn't belong in that house. Michael pretended not to notice anything, and that was what devastated Linda the most. Seeing him protect the one who humiliated him, as if love meant accepting cruelty. It was during this period that Linda began to suspect that the betrayal wasn't merely emotional. Documents disappeared from the desk. Unexplained emails arrived on Michael's computer, and a new voice, that of a certain William Harris, began to insinuate itself into family affairs. Everything indicated that Jessica was being guided, advised, or manipulated. Linda, who knew the tones of power, smelled danger before the word divorce even appeared in the conversation. And when it finally did, it sounded like a gunshot in the middle of breakfast. Jessica changed the tone of her voice, the way she walked, even the way she looked. At the house. Suddenly, everything she'd once considered home seemed like a hindrance. She spoke of half the property, of legal rights, of a new life, with a certainty that can only come from someone backed by money and promises. Linda watched everything from the corner of the kitchen, where the clock seemed to cruelly tick away. She wasn't surprised when she discovered that William Harris, the man behind the secret calls, was a powerful and manipulative businessman, adept at getting what he wanted without getting his hands dirty. Jessica, blinded by ambition, didn't understand that she had gone from wife to puppet. Michael, on the other hand, clung to the absurd hope that their love could save the marriage. Linda knew it couldn't. It was a Sunday morning when she heard something that chilled her to the core. Jessica was teaching little Sarah, her granddaughter, how to lie. "When the judge asks you, say you don't want to live with your dad, okay? Because he's sick and Mom wants the best for you." The little girl's voice, trembling, replied, "But I do want to live with him." Linda felt her soul split in two. That manipulated innocence was the line she couldn't allow to be crossed. As the sun streamed through the window and fell on the flowered tablecloth, she decided she wasn't going to stand by and watch the lie grow within her family. Perhaps she didn't know how yet, but something inside her, that old queen of the law she thought was dead, was beginning to awaken. That night, Linda didn't sleep. She paced the hall, her hands clasped over her chest, her mind replaying every word she'd ever heard. Lie, judge, sick. Those 3 words became an unbearable echo. In the next room, Michael slept poorly, his body hunched over and his cane leaning against the wall, as if he feared it too would be taken from him. In Sarah's room, a dim light illuminated the drawings hanging on the wall, all of them depicting her father with a smile. Linda stopped in front of one of them and wept silently for the little girl she loved, for the son who suffered, and for the woman she had ceased to be. The past called to her, not with nostalgia, but with purpose. Perhaps the time had come to put on her gown again, not for her, but for them. The next morning, as the smell of coffee filled the house, Linda picked up the old wooden box she kept under her bed. Inside lay her diplomas, newspaper clippings, and a rusty plaque that read, Linda Villa Señor, lawyer for the row. Oppressed. She held it in her hands, gazing at her reflection in the worn metal. Her skin was more wrinkled, yes, but her eyes retained that same flame that had ignited fear and respect in the courtroom. When Michael saw her with the open box, he understood everything without needing words. "Mom, you can't go back to that," he murmured, his voice heavy with pain. Linda looked up, serene, and replied, "Son, it's not that I can't. It's that I have no other choice." In that moment, the house regained an air it hadn't breathed in years, that of a just war about to begin. The following days were a succession of calculated silences. Linda began compiling documents, reviewing old papers, and recording every suspicious conversation that filtered through that divided house. The smell of ink and paper returned to permeate her life like an old habit that had never left. Meanwhile, Jessica grew increasingly confident, convinced that William's power and money would guarantee her victory. Dear, her arrogant naivete, she had no idea that the person silently watching her had championed impossible causes and defeated far more dangerous men. Linda wasn't seeking revenge, but justice, and although the scars of her past reminded her of what she had lost, they also showed her what she could still salvage. It was time to stop being a spectator and become a protagonist again. One afternoon, as the wind blew dry leaves across the porch, Linda heard Jessica's laughter on the phone. "Everything will be okay, William. I have the judge on my side," she said, unaware that Linda was discreetly recording her from the hallway. That sentence was the spark that confirmed her suspicions. Corruption was involved. It wasn't just a family dispute. It was a carefully planned judicial manipulation. That night, Linda went through her old desk, opened a notebook, and began to write a list of names, dates, and possible contacts. She knew she had to move cautiously. In the world of law, the truth alone wasn't enough. It had to be presented with surgical precision. As she wrote, she remembered the motto that once adorned her office: "Silence is also a strategy." Monday dawn brought with it a different air. Linda was wearing a gray coat she had worn at her last trial, and under her arm she carried a leather folder that still smelled of ink and filing dust. She walked to the county courthouse with a firm stride, though each step reminded her of the weight of years and disappointments. When she arrived, the guard looked at her curiously. He recognized that face from some old cover. "Are you going to testify, ma'am?" he asked. She simply replied, "I'm going to awaken something that's been dormant for a long time." She entered without looking back, crossing that threshold like someone returning to their own shadow. At the back of the courtroom, Judge Morales, still young when she shone, didn't immediately recognize her. But when their eyes met, it took only a second for both of them to understand that the past had returned to the bench. That same afternoon, Jessica arrived with her attorney, Jennifer Rivers, an elegant woman with a sharp smile. Linda knew her well. They had shared cases and also shared complicit silences when justice went wrong. Jennifer looked at her with a mixture of surprise and mockery. "Linda Villa, sir. I thought you had retired for good." Linda smiled without showing her teeth. "Sometimes duty calls louder than fear," she replied, with that disarming serenity. A look of discomfort crossed Jessica's face. She didn't understand that the woman who ironed her tablecloths out of courtesy had once been a legend. In that instant, the tension became palpable. The judge banged his hand on the table and the courtroom fell into an expectant silence. The battle had just begun. The case opened with the usual coldness of legal proceedings. Jennifer presented her opening argument, laced with technicalities and half-truths. She claimed that the house was marital property, that Jessica had contributed emotionally to its construction, and that Michael, due to his disability, could no longer provide a stable environment for his daughter. The words emotionally and disability resonated with measured hypocrisy. Linda, sitting next to her son, kept her hands clasped, her gaze steady, her breathing controlled. When her turn came, she stood with majestic slowness, as if time itself had restored her lost respect. "Your Honor," she said, "my name is Linda Villa, sir, and I appear not only as a mother, but as an advocate for my son and for the truth." The courtroom for a moment fell silent. Jennifer lowered her eyes. Jessica paled, and Judge Morales took a deep breath, knowing that this trial would not be like the others. Linda's presentation was precise, surgical. She described the facts without raising her voice, but with a forcefulness that made every word weigh. This house was acquired before the marriage, with documents signed, dated and registered by my son. There is no financial link whatsoever with Mrs. Torres. Then she dropped a folder of evidence on the table. Deeds, receipts, photographs, everything impeccably organized. Jennifer tried to interrupt her, but the judge stopped her. "Allow Mrs. Villa Señor to continue," she said, with a respect that grew by the minute. In the audience, the murmur turned to anticipation. That courtroom, accustomed to the tedium of routine divorces, was witnessing the rebirth of a legend. Linda, for the first time in years, felt alive again. Jennifer, her pride wounded, counterattacked with what she believed to be a masterstroke. "Your Honor, the defense is trying to divert attention with sentimentality. Mrs. Torres has evidence that her husband intentionally excluded her from his property, violating his marital duty." But Linda was unfazed. She waited for the exact moment, the silence after the exaggeration, and then she spoke. Mrs. Torres was instructed to say that. And not just her. At that instant, the courtroom held its breath. Linda took out a small recording device and, with a sharp click, let Sarah's voice fill the courtroom. "Mom, I don't want to lie. I love Dad." The echo of those words shattered the air. Jessica jumped up, yelling that it was a farce, while Jennifer tried to control the chaos. Judge Morales raised his hand, asking for silence. But the silence this time came laced with tears. Michael lowered his head, his eyes moist. Linda, with a calmness bordering on the divine, sat down again. "I don't speak on behalf of anger," she said. "I speak on behalf of a child who deserves to grow up without the shadow of lies." There was no tremor in her voice, only the certainty of someone who has already faced bigger monsters. Jessica tried to compose herself, but her face betrayed her. Shame, guilt, and fear mingled like a portrait of defeat. At the back of the courtroom, a tall man in a dark suit and with an angular face stood up and left without a word. It was William Harris. His departure was as eloquent as any testimony. The judge made a mental note as the murmurs grew louder. Linda knew the final battle was yet to come, but she also knew that, for the first time in years, justice had a woman's face. Judge Morales called a 10-minute recess, but no one moved. The air was charged with that electricity that only comes from moments when the truth cuts through the air like a sword. Jessica sank into her seat, her eyes empty, and Jennifer muttered something under her breath, desperately searching for a legal solution. Linda, meanwhile, approached her son and took his hand. "The worst part is over," she said in a low voice, although deep down she knew the war wasn't over. Sarah, sitting next to a court clerk, looked at her grandmother with a mixture of relief and admiration. That look was enough to remind Linda why she had returned. It wasn't out of pride or personal redemption. It was so that this little girl would never learn to live on her knees before lies. When the session resumed, Linda stood up again, and her figure, small, serene, but imposing, seemed to fill the entire room. Her voice became more intimate, more human. "The truth hurts, but it liberates. And when it is spoken in front of those who try to buy it, it ceases to be words and becomes justice. And if you've read this far, you probably understand what it means to fight for what's right, even when everyone turns their backs on you. Tell us where you're watching this story from and share it so others too. Remember that silence can be more powerful than shouting." The room held its breath again, and Linda, without losing the thread, continued her argument with the same calm that precedes a storm. The tension reached a point where every word seemed like a sentence. Judge Morales, his voice softer than usual, asked Linda to explain why she had left the law so many years ago. She was silent for a few seconds, and in that interval the buzzing of the overhead lights could be heard. Then, with a sigh that seemed to come from another life, she began, "I retired because corruption won once, because the man I shared my life with bribed a judge and forced me to lie. I lost my faith in justice, and in myself." Jennifer's face paled. Jessica looked at her, confused, not understanding why that confession carried so much weight. Linda continued, "But today I understand that giving up was my biggest mistake, and that redemption lies, not in winning a case, but in teaching my granddaughter that the truth is never negotiable." The judge nodded slowly, as if witnessing something that goes beyond the written law. "Thank you for your honesty, Mrs. Villa Señor," he said, and the entire courtroom felt the symbolic weight of those words. Jessica tried to intervene, seeking sympathy, but credibility had slipped through her fingers. Michael, on the other hand, wept silently. For the first time, he saw his mother not as the woman who cared for him, but as the force that sustained him. When Linda sat back down, the judge asked Sarah to speak. The girl approached with small steps, holding a stuffed animal in her hands. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. "I want to live with my dad and my grandma. They tell me the truth." At that moment, even the court officials lowered their gaze to hide their tears. Sarah's testimony was the final blow. No argument from Jennifer, no matter how technical, could erase the purity of that childlike voice that dismantled an entire web of lies. Jessica, cornered, let out a sob that seemed more of fury than regret. She tried to accuse Linda of emotional manipulation, but the judge firmly interrupted her. "Be careful what you say, Mrs. Torres. Manipulation doesn't come from those who protect, but from those who teach how to lie." The words resonated like an early verdict. Linda looked at the woman who had caused so much harm and felt something she hadn't expected: compassion. Not for who Jessica was, but for the blindness that had turned her into an instrument of her own ruin. Sometimes, she realized, justice doesn't punish with chains, but with the truth it lays bare. The courtroom prepared for the ruling. The judge asked everyone to remain silent while he reviewed the final documents. During that period of waiting, the clearest sound was that of a clock ticking away, as if time itself wished to bear witness. Linda breathed deeply, looking at her son, her granddaughter, and, for a moment, at herself reflected in the courtroom glass. She had begun this journey seeking justice for her loved ones, but what she had found was something deeper: reconciliation with her own faith in the law. Michael squeezed her hand, speechless. Jessica continued to cry, her head bowed, while Jennifer packed her papers without looking up. No one dared to speak, because everyone knew that the story told there would be etched in memory beyond any sentence. Judge Morales rose slowly, with a solemnity that made everyone in the courtroom hold their breath. I have listened carefully to the arguments, the testimony, and above all, to the voice of a child who still believes in the truth. This court cannot and should not ignore that. He paused, reviewing the documents before him one last time. Then, in a firm voice, he pronounced, I declare that the ownership of the house belongs exclusively to Mr. Michael Villa Señor, acquired before the marriage. Custody of the minor, Sarah Villa Señor, will remain under the joint responsibility of the father and maternal grandmother. Ms. Torres loses financial rights to the property and may visit the child only under judicial supervision. No one breathed for a few seconds. And then, when the gavel struck the table, the echo of the verdict seemed to release years of pent-up pain in a single instant. Michael wept shamelessly, hugging his mother and daughter, while Linda remained still, as if she couldn't quite believe that justice had reawakened. Jessica slumped in her chair, defeated, and Jennifer hurried out, her face tense, without looking back. Judge Morales approached Linda before leaving the courtroom and said in a low voice, When I was young, I dreamed of being like you. Thank you for reminding me why I got into this business. She barely nodded with a tired but genuine smile. Outside, the air smelled of rain and hope. Sarah jumped in the puddles in the parking lot, laughing for the first time in months. Linda, seeing her, understood that her battle had not been in vain. She had defended not just a home, but the future of a girl who deserved to grow up without fear. The days following the trial passed with a strange calm, as if the house itself needed to learn to breathe again. Michael, still leaning on his crutches, began repairing the cracks in the ceiling, sanding the windows, bringing life back to every corner. Sarah filled the walls with new drawings, no longer of sadness, but of hope. And Linda, from the garden, silently watched as life rearranged itself, petal by petal, around them. Sometimes, while making coffee or watering the lavender, she still heard in her mind the echo of her granddaughter's voice in court. That innocence turned into truth had been more powerful than any legal argument. It was living proof that justice, even if delayed, always finds its way back. One afternoon, as the sun filtered through the branches of the old orange tree, Linda sat with Sarah at the porch table doing homework. The air smelled of toast and calm. Linda looked up and saw her granddaughter smiling. She realized then that her greatest legacy wasn't her past as a lawyer, but rather having restored that child's faith in the truth. In that instant, the queen of the law once again became simply a mother, a grandmother, a woman who had chosen courage over silence. As the weeks passed, the house once again filled with familiar sounds, the clang of cups, the hum of the old fan, and Sarah's light laughter as Michael stumbled over his tools. It was as if the home, which had been the scene of so much sadness, had decided to forgive as well. Linda resumed her routine with a different serenity. She was no longer the woman fleeing the past, but someone who had faced and overcome it. Each sunrise reminded her that justice, though belated, had once again been restored. However, not all was calm. On the local news, a brief headline mentioned William Harris being investigated for fraud. Linda read it without surprise. Fate sometimes has a precise way of closing circles. Jessica disappeared completely from the city. Some said they'd seen her in a downtown cafe looking for work. Others, that she'd left with a new last name. But Linda didn't need to know that. Her fight wasn't against a woman, but against the poison of lies that nearly destroyed her family. On rainy days, she sat by the window with a blanket over her legs, watching Sarah play with her father. Michael began to put his crutches aside more, taking short but firm steps, each a symbol of rebirth. And Linda, looking at that scene, understood that there was something stronger than any court ruling: rebuilt dignity. With summer came unexpected visitors, old neighbors who wanted to say hello, local journalists requesting interviews, and even young law students who wanted to meet the legendary Queen of the Law. Linda politely declined them all. She didn't seek fame or recognition. Her victory was private, made up of small gestures, a quiet breakfast, an afternoon without arguments, a child who slept peacefully. Sometimes, while knitting on the porch, she thought about the women she had met in court, those who were never able to defend themselves. She vowed to write their stories one day, not as a lawyer, but as a witness. She wanted to make it clear that justice may be silent, but it is never absent. One afternoon, Michael arrived with an old box in his hands. "I found it. In the basement," he said, letting the dust escape in a golden breath. Inside were letters, newspaper clippings, and a notebook with notes from old cases. Among them, Linda found a letter of his, written years before, in which he confessed his fear of having become a shadow. She smiled with that mixture of nostalgia and relief that only someone who has outlived themselves feels. "I'm not that woman anymore," she murmured. Michael hugged her tightly, and Sarah, curious, asked if she could read a story. Linda looked at her and replied, "Someday, when you understand that the truth is also inherited." It was then that she realized that her legacy would not be in the courtroom, but in the generations who grew up with her example. Autumn painted the streets golden, and with it came a sense of balance Linda hadn't felt in decades. Every morning the smell of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of Sarah practicing her piano filled the house with a peace that seemed almost unreal. Michael had begun working remotely, designing plans for community projects, determined to build accessible spaces for people with limited mobility. "I want no one to go through what I went through," he said with a calm smile. Linda watched him with a pride that needed no words. She had raised a man who didn't break, but transformed. And in that process, she too, once again became part of something bigger than her own story, a chain of resilience that stretched through time. One afternoon, while collecting leaves in the garden, Linda found a piece of the old, rusty plaque that had once hung in her office among the bushes. The name was barely legible, but it was enough to make a tear fall onto the metal, not out of sadness, but out of gratitude. She put the piece in her pocket and stared at the sky, where the clouds seemed to move in time with her breathing. It no longer hurt to remember her past. She had learned that forgiveness wasn't forgetting what happened, but rather freeing herself from the weight of carrying it. Silently, she gave thanks to life, to time, and to that inner voice that never abandoned her, even when she herself had chosen to silence it. As the months passed, Linda began to write again. Not laws, not lawsuits, but memoirs. In a red-covered notebook, she recounted every detail of the trial, the sleepless nights, the small gestures that marked change. She did so with no intention of publishing, only to record what truth can reconstruct when defended with one's soul. Sometimes Sarah would sit beside her, drawing hearts in the margins of the pages, and Linda would smile at her without saying anything. She understood that justice is not taught with speeches, but by example. Each written word was a seed for the future, a silent legacy that perhaps one day would germinate in another female voice, strong and determined not to allow corruption or fear to win again. Winter arrived with its usual stillness. The steamed windows reflected a house that no longer breathed pain, but history. Michael hosted a small family dinner to celebrate his mother's birthday, inviting only close neighbors. The table was filled with laughter, simple dishes, and the aroma of the stew Linda always made on cold days. When someone mentioned what had happened months before, she brushed it off. "That's in the past," she said as she served the bread. But deep down, she knew that the past was, in fact, the root of her new life. That night, as she blew out the candles, she reflected on the irony of it all. She had left the law out of disillusionment, and it was precisely the law, her own faith in it, that finally brought her back to her senses. That thought didn't leave her for days. On her morning walks, wrapped in a long coat and a scarf knitted by Sarah, she would look at the neighboring houses and wonder how many dormant truths lay behind each window. We all have a pending trial, she would reflect, not before a judge, but before her own conscience. In her case, that trial had ended with a silent verdict: redemption. People in the neighborhood began to greet her with more respect, although she remained the same discreet woman who bought bread on the corner and chatted with the flowers in her garden. Only now, her every word seemed to carry a different weight, as if she were speaking for all the women who had once been underestimated for daring to stand firm. One Sunday afternoon, Sarah asked her to help her with a homework assignment about real-life heroes. Linda, amused, asked her who she was planning to choose. "You," the girl replied without hesitation, "because you fought with words instead of shouts." Linda stood still for a few seconds, trying to contain her emotion. "Then teach them that, darling," she said, "that words can also be swords." Sarah wrote that sentence in her notebook, while Michael watched from the doorway with a proud smile. In that instant, Linda felt that her story no longer belonged to her alone. It had become part of something larger, an invisible legacy woven with courage, tenderness, and silence that would live on long after she was gone. With the arrival of spring, Linda decided to return to the courthouse, not as a lawyer, but as a visitor. She wanted to close the circle. She walked through the same halls where she had once lost faith, and now saw them filled with young lawyers, some hasty, others uncertain, all with the brightness of someone who still believes in something. She sat in the back of an ordinary courtroom, listening to a minor case involving a neighborhood dispute, and smiled. Justice was still alive, albeit imperfect, like everything human. As she left, she paused in front of a plaque bearing her name among the old bar awards. She ran her fingers over the worn letters and whispered, "I didn't need to come back here to be who I am, but thank you for reminding me." On the way home, the wind blew with that orange scent that only her garden had. Sarah ran toward her, with a leaf in her hand, a drawing of the 3 generations, her father, and her grandmother, under a huge sun and a phrase written in crooked letters, "Truth wins." Linda hung it on the living room wall, right above her old lawyer's plaque. That simple image was worth more than all the accolades she'd ever received. Michael made tea in the kitchen, and the house was once again filled with the same sound that had accompanied her during the difficult years, the hissing of boiling water. Only, now that sound no longer brought her anxiety, but peace. The peace of someone who knew how to fight and, finally, rest. That night, Linda went out into the garden with a blanket over her shoulders. The sky was clear and the stars seemed closer than ever. She remembered her husband, David, and everything that betrayal had destroyed. But surprisingly, she no longer held resentment. She had learned that even pain has a purpose: to teach. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the fresh air caress her face. In her mind, she heard Judge Morales's words again. "Thank you for reminding me why I entered this profession." He smiled sweetly. Perhaps that had been her role all along, to remind the world, by her example, that justice is not an institution, but a decision made every day, and she, after so many silences, had decided to honor it. The wind gently moved the branches of the old orange tree, and one of its blossoms fell right into her lap. Linda took it between her fingers and looked at it as if it were a small crown. "I don't need titles anymore," she murmured. From the window, Sarah was calling her to dinner, and Michael was beckoning from the kitchen, laughing knowingly. In that instant, she realized she had won much more than a case. She had regained her home, her purpose, and her peace. She walked slowly toward the house, still holding the blossom, leaving the moonlit garden behind. Each step was a farewell to the past, but also a welcome to the future. Because in the end, even queens deserve to rest when justice returns to its throne. As the days passed, Linda began to notice that her story no longer belonged solely to her. A neighbor, seeing her at the store, confided that she had returned to law school, inspired by her example. A young lawyer sent her a letter thanking her for showing that integrity could still win in the courts, and without intending to, Linda became an almost legendary figure among those who had lost faith in the system. But she didn't see herself that way. "I only did what I had to," she always replied. Yet deep down, she knew she had ignited something, a spark of courage in people she would never meet. Her life, once marked by disappointment, had become a silent beacon for others who still walked in the shadows. One morning, Sarah walked into her room, a notebook in her hand. "Grandma, at school they asked me to write about what I want to be when I grow up," she said, her eyes shining. "And what did you write?" Linda asked, smiling. "I want to be someone who tells the truth, like you." That answer completely disarmed her. She hugged her tightly, feeling the warmth and innocence of that promise. "Then you are already so much more than I was," she whispered. In that hug, Linda understood that her true victory lay not in the court records, but in the heart of that little girl who would one day tell her story not as a tragedy, but as a testament to love, courage, and truth. Time continued its course with the same elegance as Linda's passage through her garden. The years didn't harden her, they only made her more selective with her peace. Visits from former colleagues became frequent, some seeking advice, others simply wanting to share a coffee with the woman who had restored dignity to their profession. Sometimes she accepted, other times she simply smiled from the doorway, saying that now her best tribunal was the silence of afternoons with her granddaughter. She had understood that. Not every trial needs an audience, nor every victory require applause. In that stillness, she found something that had been denied to her for years, the certainty that her story had finally made sense. That afternoon, as the sun set and the sky turned orange, Linda wrote the last lines of her notebook. Her handwriting, steady and serene, seemed to seal a cycle. And before closing this story, if you've ever felt life was unfair to you, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to believe in second chances. Tell me where you're watching this from, and thank you for being with this mother who never gave up until the end. Then Linda closed the notebook and left it on the table. Outside, the sound of Sarah laughing mingled with the chirping of crickets. It was the perfect echo of a life that had finally made peace with silence. Linda stood up from the porch with a slight effort, feeling the familiar creak in her knees, but without the soul-weary feeling that had accompanied her for so many years. She walked to the old orange tree and touched its trunk lovingly, as if silently thanking it for having witnessed all her battles. The sweet scent of flowers floated in the air, the same scent that permeated the happy days of her childhood. From there she could see the house lit up, Michael reviewing papers at the table, Sarah writing in her notebook, and she felt something that cannot be explained with words, the certainty of having fulfilled her purpose. Not all heroes wear capes, she thought. Some just know when to speak and when to remain silent. That night, the sky over Chicago seemed clearer than ever. Linda sat in her favorite armchair, her red notebook on her knees, and opened it to the last page. She wrote a single sentence. "Justice doesn't always come when we expect it, but it always finds those who deserve it." She smiled, closed the notebook, and placed it on the table next to a still warm cup of tea. Outside, the wind gently stirred the curtains, and a child's laughter filled the house. Linda closed her eyes, letting that melody be her farewell. Not to life, but to the weight of the past. The Queen of the Law had found peace, and in that complete silence, she understood that the true verdict of her story was love.